The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Horse Guards Parade as Colonel James Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what would be his final inspection as commanding officer of the Blues and Royals. The regiment, officially known as the Royal Horse Guards and 1st Dragoons, had been his life for over 3 decades, but today marked the end of an era that stretched back centuries, standing before the magnificent horses that would soon carry his soldiers in the Queen's Birthday Parade. Mitchell reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought this prestigious regiment to this moment. The Blues and Royals weren't just another military unit. They were living history, a bridge between Britain's turbulent past and its modern identity. The story began in 1661 when King Charles II, freshly restored to the throne after years of civil war and exile, recognized the need for a loyal cavalry regiment to protect the monarchy. The political landscape of England remained unstable, with whispers of republicanism still echoing through the corridors of power. Charles II understood that his survival depended not just on popular support, but on having trusted soldiers who would stand between him and any potential threats. The Royal Horse Guards, originally called His Majesty's Own Troop of Horse Guards, emerged from this necessity. These weren't ordinary soldiers recruited from the countryside. They were carefully selected men, often from noble families who had demonstrated unwavering loyalty to the crown. Their distinctive blue uniforms, which would later give them their famous nickname, the Blues, were chosen to distinguish them from other military units and to symbolize their direct connection to royal authority. Parallel to this development, another cavalry regiment was taking shape. The Royal Dragoons, formed in 1661 as well, represented a different military tradition. Unlike the Horse Guards, who focused on ceremonial duties and close protection of the monarch, the Dragoons were designed as a mobile fighting force. They were mounted infantry, capable of riding quickly to battle locations and then dismounting to fight on foot with muskets and swords. The early years tested both regiments severely. The Great Fire of London in 1666 saw both units working tirelessly to maintain order as the city burned for 4 days and nights. Soldiers helped evacuate citizens, protected valuable goods from looters, and assisted in firefighting efforts when the regular fire services proved inadequate. This crisis demonstrated their value beyond mere ceremonial functions. Political tensions reached their peak during the Monmouth Rebellion in 1685. James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, and illegitimate son of Charles II, landed in England with a small army, claiming the throne from his uncle, James II. The rebellion attracted thousands of supporters, particularly in the West Country, where Protestant sentiment ran strong against the Catholic king. Both the Horse Guards and the Royal Dragoons were mobilized to suppress this uprising. The campaign tested their mettle in ways that palace duties never could. They marched through Somerset and Dorset, engaging rebel forces in several skirmishes before the decisive Battle of Sedgemoor. This battle, fought in the early hours of July 6, 1685, would prove to be the last pitched battle fought on English soil. The aftermath of Sedgemoor was brutal. Judge Jeffreys' bloody assizes saw hundreds of rebels executed or transported to the colonies. The cavalry regiments, having played crucial roles in the rebellion's suppression, found themselves more firmly entrenched in royal favor than ever before. Their loyalty during this crisis established a trust that would endure for centuries. As the 17th century drew to a close, both regiments had proven themselves indispensable to the monarchy's survival. They had evolved from hastily assembled loyalist forces into professional military units with distinct traditions, proud histories, and unshakable devotion to the crown. The foundations were laid for what would become one of Britain's most celebrated military institutions. The transformation from separate entities to a unified force would take centuries, but the groundwork was already apparent in these early decades. Officers frequently transferred between regiments, creating informal networks of friendship and shared experience. Joint training exercises became common, and both units developed similar tactical doctrines despite their different primary roles. 1700, observers could see that these weren't just two separate cavalry regiments serving the same monarch. They were becoming part of something larger, a military tradition that combined the pageantry and loyalty of the Horse Guards with the fighting spirit and tactical flexibility of the Dragoons. This fusion of ceremonial duty and military effectiveness would define their character for the next 3 centuries. The stage was set for adventures that would take them from the battlefields of Europe to the palaces of kings, from colonial campaigns in distant lands to the very heart of British democracy at Westminster. Their blue uniforms would become synonymous with royal occasions, while their battle honors would reflect service in every major conflict involving British forces. As Colonel Mitchell watched his soldiers prepare for another day of ceremonial duties, he knew he was witnessing the continuation of a story that began with those first nervous cavalrymen in 1661, uncertain of their future, but determined to serve their king faithfully, whatever challenges lay ahead. The Duke of Marlborough's tent stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness outside the Bavarian village of Blenheim. Inside, maps covered every available surface, marked with positions of French and Bavarian forces that seemed to stretch endlessly across the landscape. It was August 13, 1704, and Captain Edward Thornley of the Royal Horse Guards knew that tomorrow would bring the most decisive battle of the War of Spanish Succession. Thornley had joined the regiment 5 years earlier, following his father's footsteps into royal service. Like many of his fellow officers, he came from a family where military service to the crown was considered both duty and honor. The past few years had taken him across Europe, from the Low Countries to the Rhine, always in the thick of Marlborough's campaigns against Louis XIV's attempts to dominate the continent. The morning of August 13th broke with unusual clarity. As the Allied army formed up for battle, Thornley could see the blue uniforms of his regiment taking their position in the center of the line. Beside them, the Royal Dragoons prepared their carbines and checked their swords one final time. Both regiments had learned to work together seamlessly during the long campaigns, their initial distinctions blurring in the face of practical military necessity. The Battle of Blenheim became a masterpiece of military coordination. Marlborough's plan required precise timing and absolute courage from every unit involved. The Horse Guards, traditionally used for ceremonial duties back in London, found themselves charging across open ground into the massed infantry of the finest army in Europe. The sound of thousands of hooves thundering across the battlefield mixed with the crack of muskets and the clash of steel on steel. Thornley found himself in the thick of the action as his squadron smashed into a French infantry square. The training that had seemed so routine back at barracks suddenly became a matter of life and death. His horse stumbled over fallen bodies, but he managed to maintain his seat as his saber cut down at the enemy soldiers below. Around him, his men fought with a ferocity that surprised even themselves. The Royal Dragoons, meanwhile, had dismounted and were fighting as infantry alongside Marlborough's foot soldiers. Their mobility had allowed them to reinforce weak points in the Allied line, and their marksmanship was proving devastating to French cavalry charges. The flexibility that had been built into their original design was paying dividends in this most complex of battles. By afternoon, the French army was in full retreat. Marshal Tallard, the French commander, had been captured along with thousands of his men. The victory at Blenheim broke French military prestige and marked the beginning of the end for Louis XIV's dreams of European domination. Both British cavalry regiments had played crucial roles in this triumph, earning battle honors that would be carried on their standards for centuries to come. The years following Blenheim saw both regiments involved in a series of campaigns that would reshape the map of Europe. At Ramillies in 1706, they participated in another of Marlborough's victories, this time in the Spanish Netherlands. The battle demonstrated how British cavalry could work in coordination with infantry and artillery to achieve results that no single arm could accomplish alone. Oudenarde in 1708 presented different challenges, fighting in broken terrain along the River Scheldt. Both regiments had to adapt their tactics to circumstances that bore no resemblance to the open battlefields they preferred. Small unit actions became the norm, with individual squadrons operating independently for hours at a time. This experience taught valuable lessons about leadership and initiative that would serve them well in future conflicts. The final great victory of this era came at Malplaquet in 1709, the bloodiest battle of the entire war. The French, fighting desperately to defend their homeland, contested every yard of ground with savage determination. The casualties were enormous on both sides, But the Allied victory opened the road to Paris and effectively ended French resistance. Between battles, garrison duty in various European cities gave both regiments exposure to different military traditions and cultures. Officers studied continental cavalry tactics, learned new languages, and formed relationships with Allied forces that would prove valuable in future campaigns. The regiments were becoming truly international in outlook while maintaining their distinctly British character. The War of Spanish Succession officially ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, but its impact on both cavalry regiments extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. They had proven themselves capable of sustained campaigning in the most demanding conditions. Officers had gained experience in high-level strategy and tactics, while enlisted men had developed the confidence that comes from repeated victory over Europe's best armies. Perhaps more importantly, the close cooperation between the Horse Guards and Royal Dragoons during these campaigns had created bonds that transcended their organizational boundaries. Officers who had fought together at Blenheim maintained friendships throughout their careers. Tactical innovations developed by one regiment were quickly adopted by the other. A shared culture was emerging that emphasized both professional excellence and loyalty to comrades. The return to England brought new challenges. Peacetime garrison duty could be tedious after the excitement of active campaigning, but both regiments adapted by focusing on ceremonial responsibilities and training for future conflicts. The lessons learned in European warfare were incorporated into drill manuals and tactical doctrine, ensuring that the hard-won expertise would not be lost. As the 18th century progressed, it became clear that these experiences had fundamentally changed both regiments. They were no longer simply royal bodyguards or mounted infantry. They had become professional cavalry units capable of operating effectively in any theater and against any enemy. The foundations were being laid for the eventual merger that would create one of Britain's most distinguished military formations. Lieutenant Colonel William Ponsonby of the Royal Dragoons felt the familiar mixture of excitement and dread as he watched the French cavalry massing across the muddy battlefield of Waterloo. The date was June 18, 1815, and after months of preparation, Napoleon's final gamble was about to unfold before his eyes. 23 years of almost continuous warfare against revolutionary and imperial France had brought both the Horse Guards and Royal Dragoons to this moment of ultimate decision. The Peninsular War in Spain and Portugal had already tested both regiments severely. For 6 years they had fought through the harsh terrain of Iberia, learning to cope with guerrilla warfare, extreme weather, and supply shortages that would have broken lesser units. The battles of Salamanca, Vitoria, and the siege of Badajoz had forged them into veteran formations capable of handling any military challenge. Ponsonby remembered the scorching heat of the Spanish plains and the bitter cold of winter campaigns in the mountains. His men had learned to live off the land when supply convoys failed to arrive, to march 20 miles a day through dust or mud, and to fight effectively whether mounted or on foot. The flexibility that had always characterized both regiments had been refined to perfection during those grueling years. The news of Napoleon's escape from Elba had electrified Europe in March 1815. Within weeks, both regiments found themselves part of the hastily assembled army that Wellington was gathering in Belgium. Many of the officers and men had served under the Iron Duke during the Peninsular campaigns, and they knew his methods intimately. This familiarity would prove crucial in the coming battle. At Quatre Bras, 2 days before Waterloo, both cavalry regiments had their first taste of action against Napoleon's reorganized army. The fighting was fierce but inconclusive, serving mainly to delay the French advance on Brussels while Wellington positioned his forces for the decisive battle that everyone knew was coming. Now, as dawn broke over the ridge at Waterloo, Ponsonby could see the distinctive uniforms of both his own Royal Dragoons and the Horse Guards taking their assigned positions in Wellington's carefully chosen defensive line. The recent heavy rain had turned the battlefield into a quagmire that would affect cavalry operations throughout the day, but both regiments had learned to adapt to whatever conditions they encountered. The French attack began with a massive artillery bombardment that shook the ground and filled the air with smoke and screaming metal. Both cavalry regiments, positioned behind the ridgeline, were relatively protected from this preliminary barrage. but they could hear the devastating impact on Wellington's infantry squares. The discipline required to wait in reserve while comrades were dying nearby was perhaps the hardest part of any cavalryman's duty. When d'Erlon's infantry corps finally advanced against the Allied left center, both regiments received the order they had been waiting for. The charge that followed would become one of the most famous cavalry actions in military history. Over 2,000 British heavy cavalry, including both the Horse Guards and Royal Dragoons, thundered down the slope into the advancing French columns. The impact was devastating. French infantry formations that had seemed unstoppable moments before dissolved under the weight of the cavalry charge. Ponsonby found himself in hand-to-hand combat with French officers, his sword work refined by years of campaign experience. Around him, his men were performing with the precision that came from extensive training and absolute confidence in their comrades. The Royal Horse Guards, fighting alongside the Royal Dragoons, showed that their ceremonial duties had not softened their fighting edge. Officers who had spent years escorting royal carriages through London streets now led charges against Napoleon's finest troops with the same attention to detail and professional pride they had always displayed. The initial success was overwhelming, but it carried the seeds of near disaster. Carried away by their triumph, many cavalrymen pursued the broken French infantry too far, leaving themselves vulnerable to counterattack. French cavalry reserves, led by cuirassiers in gleaming armor, struck back with deadly effectiveness. Ponsonby himself fell during this phase of the battle, cut down by French lancers while trying to rally his scattered men. His death symbolized both the glory and the tragedy of cavalry warfare in the Napoleonic era. The charge had achieved its tactical objective, breaking d'Erlon's attack and saving Wellington's line, but at enormous cost in experienced officers and men. The remainder of the battle saw both regiments involved in a series of smaller actions, supporting infantry squares against repeated French cavalry charges, covering the retreat of broken Allied units, and gradually wearing down Napoleon's increasingly desperate attacks. Their versatility proved crucial as the battle's momentum shifted back and forth throughout the long afternoon. As evening approached and the Prussians finally arrived to tip the balance decisively, both regiments participated in the final pursuit of Napoleon's broken army. The sight of French soldiers throwing away their weapons and fleeing in panic marked the end of an era that had begun with the Revolution 26 years earlier. The victory at Waterloo had cost both regiments heavily in casualties, but it had also confirmed their reputation as among Europe's finest cavalry. More importantly, the shared experience of this climactic battle had strengthened the bonds between the Horse Guards and Royal Dragoons that had been developing for over a century. The post-war period brought significant changes to both regiments. The long European conflicts had demonstrated the need for military reform, and both units found themselves adapting to new weapons, tactics, and organizational structures. The lessons learned from 23 years of almost continuous warfare were incorporated into training programs and tactical manuals that would influence British military thinking for generations. Officers who had served together at Waterloo maintained close relationships throughout their careers, often transferring between regiments and sharing expertise gained in different theaters of operation. This cross-fertilization of ideas and experience was gradually creating a unified military culture that transcended the original distinctions between the ceremonial Horse Guards and the more tactically oriented Dragoons. The scorching heat of the Indian frontier beat down mercilessly on Major Charles Fraser as he surveyed the dust-covered column of the Royal Horse Guards making its way through the Khyber Pass. The year was 1878, and the Second Afghan War had drawn both regiments away from their traditional duties in London to face an entirely different kind of warfare in the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan. Fraser had spent 15 years with the Horse Guards, most of it in the comfortable routine of ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. The transition to active campaigning on the northwest frontier had been jarring for many of his men, who were more accustomed to crowd control at royal events than fighting tribal warriors in some of the world's most inhospitable terrain. The British Empire had reached its zenith, and both cavalry regiments found themselves deployed across the globe in support of imperial objectives. While one squadron might be performing ceremonial duties for Queen Victoria in London, another would be patrolling the borders of India or maintaining order in Ireland during periods of political unrest. The Indian Mutiny of 1857 had already tested both regiments' adaptability. The Horse Guards had been quickly dispatched to India when news of the uprising reached London, while elements of the Royal Dragoons had been serving there throughout the crisis. The siege of Delhi and the relief of Lucknow had shown that British cavalry could be effective in the unique conditions of the subcontinent, where monsoons, extreme heat, and unfamiliar diseases posed challenges as dangerous as enemy action. Fraser remembered the stories told by veterans of that campaign. Cavalry charges through the narrow streets of Indian cities, where traditional European tactics had to be abandoned in favor of dismounted fighting. The difficulty of maintaining horses in a climate that killed European animals with alarming regularity, and the constant threat of ambush from an enemy who knew the terrain intimately. Now, 2 decades later, the Afghan frontier presented similar challenges, but with the added complexity of mountain warfare. The tribal fighters they faced were among the world's finest marksmen, armed with rifles that were often superior to standard British military weapons. They knew every path and hiding place in terrain that seemed designed by nature to favor the defender. The Royal Dragoons had adapted more quickly to these conditions. Their tradition of fighting dismounted, serving them well in country where mounted operations were often impossible. They had learned to use their horses primarily for transportation, dismounting to fight as infantry in the rocky defiles and steep slopes that characterized much of the Afghan border region. Both regiments had also become involved in the complex politics of imperial administration. Officers found themselves serving not just as military commanders but as diplomats, negotiators with tribal chiefs, intelligence gatherers, and administrators of vast territories with diverse populations. The skills required for these roles were far removed from traditional cavalry training, but both regiments proved remarkably adaptable. The experience of colonial warfare was changing the character of both units in subtle but important ways. Officers who had grown up in the relatively structured environment of European military tradition found themselves making independent decisions in situations their training had never anticipated. Initiative and personal judgment became more valuable than strict adherence to regulations. Meanwhile, back in London, other elements of both regiments continued their ceremonial responsibilities. The contrast could not have been more stark. While Fraser and his men were fighting for their lives in Afghan mountain passes, their comrades were escorting the Queen to the state opening of Parliament or participating in elaborate military reviews in Hyde Park. This division of roles was creating an interesting dynamic within both regiments. Officers and men who had served on imperial frontiers returned to ceremonial duties with a different perspective on military service. They had seen combat, dealt with life and death situations, and developed a professional confidence that enhanced their performance even in purely ceremonial roles. The technological changes of the late 19th century were also affecting both regiments significantly. The introduction of breech-loading rifles, improved artillery, and eventually machine guns was making traditional cavalry charges increasingly obsolete. Both regiments were experimenting with new tactics that emphasized mobility and firepower, rather than shock action. Communication improvements, particularly the telegraph, meant that regiments serving in distant parts of the empire could maintain closer contact with headquarters in London. Orders could be transmitted quickly, intelligence could be shared more effectively, and the overall coordination of imperial military forces was becoming more sophisticated. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, had dramatically reduced the time required to move troops between Britain and India. What had once been a journey of several months around the Cape of Good Hope was now a matter of weeks through the Mediterranean and Red Sea. This improved mobility meant that both regiments could be deployed more flexibly in response to imperial crises. Fraser's current mission involved escorting a political agent to negotiate with tribal leaders along the Afghan border. The work required equal measures of military skill and diplomatic finesse, as a single misunderstanding could trigger conflicts that might take years to resolve. His men had to be ready for action at any moment, while simultaneously demonstrating the restraint and professionalism expected of representatives of the British Crown. The lessons learned during these imperial campaigns were gradually being incorporated into both regiments' institutional knowledge. Training programs were modified to include mountain warfare, desert operations, and tropical disease prevention. Officers were encouraged to study foreign languages and cultures, recognizing that effective imperial administration required understanding of local conditions and customs. Perhaps most importantly, the shared experience of serving across the empire was continuing to blur the distinctions between the horse guards and royal dragoons. Officers routinely transferred between regiments, bringing with them expertise gained in different theaters and different types of operations. A common professional culture was emerging that valued adaptability, initiative, and loyalty to comrades above rigid adherence to historical traditions. Captain Robert Thornton crouched in the muddy trench, listening to the whistle and crash of German artillery shells falling on the Western Front. The date was July 1916, and the Battle of the Somme was about to begin. Around him, men of both, the Royal Horse Guards and Royal Dragoons, checked their rifles and bayonets, preparing for an attack that would epitomize the tragic transformation of cavalry warfare in the 20th century. The Great War had changed everything for both regiments. The mechanized slaughter of the Western Front bore no resemblance to the cavalry charges that had defined military glory for centuries. Horses, when they could be kept alive in the hellish conditions of no man's land, served mainly to transport supplies and wounded men. The proud cavalry traditions of both regiments had been forced to adapt to trench warfare, where success was measured in yards gained rather than enemy formations scattered. Thornton had joined the Horse Guards in 1910, attracted by the regiment's ceremonial splendor and the prospect of serving as a royal escort. His initial training had focused on horsemanship, saber work, and the complex choreography required for state occasions. Nothing had prepared him for the reality of industrial warfare, where machine guns could cut down entire formations in minutes, and artillery barrages could obliterate centuries of military tradition in a matter of hours. Both regiments had been among the first British units to reach France in August 1914, still expecting to fight a war of movement where cavalry would play a decisive role. The initial German advance had indeed provided opportunities for traditional cavalry action, with both regiments participating in reconnaissance missions and rearguard actions during the retreat from Montbard. The Battle of Le Cateau in August 1914 had marked the beginning of the end for cavalry as a decisive battlefield force. German machine guns and quick-firing artillery had torn through cavalry charges with devastating effectiveness. Officers who had spent years perfecting their saber technique found themselves leading dismounted attacks with rifles and grenades, skills they had learned hastily in training camps behind the lines. By Christmas 1914, the war of movement had ended, and both regiments found themselves manning sections of the ever-expanding trench systems that would define the next 4 years of conflict. The transition was painful for men whose identity had been built around mounted warfare, but both units adapted with characteristic professionalism. The Royal Dragoons, with their tradition of fighting dismounted, adjusted somewhat more easily to trench warfare. Their experience in colonial campaigns had taught them infantry tactics and marksmanship skills that proved valuable in the new conditions. Many of their officers had served on the northwest frontier, where fighting on foot was common, and where individual initiative was more important than parade ground precision. The Horse Guards faced a more difficult transition. Their ceremonial background seemed almost irrelevant to the demands of trench warfare, but the discipline and attention to detail that had made them outstanding ceremonial soldiers proved surprisingly valuable in the complex logistics of modern warfare. The same precision that had been required for royal escort duties was now applied to artillery coordination, supply management, and the countless administrative tasks that kept fighting units operational. Both regiments participated in the major offensives that characterized the middle years of the war. At the Somme, Passchendaele, and Cambrai, they learned the bitter lessons of warfare against entrenched positions defended by modern weapons. The casualty rates were appalling, but both units maintained their fighting effectiveness through a combination of traditional discipline and adaptation to new tactical realities. The introduction of tanks in 1916 represented another technological revolution that both regiments had to absorb. Some officers transferred to the new tank corps, bringing with them the cavalry virtues of speed and aggressive leadership that proved valuable in armored warfare. Others remained with their traditional units, working to develop combined arms tactics that could integrate infantry, artillery, and the few remaining mounted elements. The German Spring Offensive of 1918 provided one of the war's few opportunities for mounted action on the Western Front. As German forces broke through Allied lines, both cavalry regiments found themselves engaged in mobile operations reminiscent of earlier conflicts. The successful defense against this final German effort demonstrated that cavalry still had a role to play, albeit a much reduced one compared to previous wars. Thornton survived the war, but like many of his contemporaries, he returned home profoundly changed by the experience. The certainties that had guided military thinking for centuries had been shattered by 4 years of mechanized warfare. Both regiments faced the challenge of redefining their role in a world where technology seemed to be making traditional military skills obsolete. The interwar period brought significant organizational changes for both regiments. The lessons of the Great War were gradually incorporated into training programs, but there was also a conscious effort to preserve the traditions and esprit de corps that had sustained both units through centuries of service. This tension between modernization and tradition would continue to shape their development throughout the 20th century. In 1922, a momentous decision was made that would reshape the future of both regiments. The Royal Horse Guards and Royal Dragoons were officially amalgamated to form the Blues and Royals, combining their histories, traditions, and battle honors into a single unit. This merger recognized the reality that had been developing for over 2 centuries. The practical distinctions between the two regiments had largely disappeared, while their shared values and experiences had created a unified military culture. The new regiment retained elements from both parent units. The distinctive blue uniforms of the Horse Guards were preserved for ceremonial occasions, while the fighting traditions of both regiments were honored equally. Battle honors stretching from Blenheim to the Somme were combined on a single set of colors, creating a military heritage of extraordinary breadth and distinction. The amalgamation was not merely administrative convenience. It represented the formal recognition of bonds that had been forged over centuries of shared service. Officers and men who had fought together on battlefields from Waterloo to the Western Front were now officially part of the same regiment. Their common experiences and values finally given institutional expression. Colonel James Mitchell stood at attention as Queen Elizabeth II approached the ceremonial line of Blues and Royals soldiers on Horse Guards parade. The year was 2022, and this would be her final Trooping the Color ceremony as their colonel-in-chief, a role she had held with distinction for over 70 years. The moment embodied 3 centuries of continuous service to the crown, from those first uncertain cavalrymen in 1661 to the modern professional soldiers who now carried forward their legacy. The regiment had undergone dramatic transformations since its formation in 1922, but the core values established by the original Horse Guards and Royal Dragoons remained unchanged. The blue tunics worn by the ceremonial soldiers were direct descendants of those chosen by Charles II, while their military effectiveness had been proven repeatedly in conflicts from the Western Desert to Afghanistan. The Second World War had tested the Blues and Royals in ways that even the Great War had not. The rapid mechanization of warfare had finally relegated horses to purely ceremonial roles, but the regiment had adapted with characteristic professionalism to become one of Britain's premier armored units. From the deserts of North Africa to the beaches of Normandy, they had proven that the virtues of cavalry, speed, aggression, and tactical flexibility could be translated effectively to tank warfare. Mitchell remembered the stories told by his predecessors about the North African campaign, where Blues and Royals tanks had fought Rommel's Afrika Korps across hundreds of miles of desert. The same navigational skills that had once been essential for cavalry reconnaissance proved invaluable for armored units operating in trackless wilderness, while the traditional cavalry emphasis on maintenance and care of equipment translated perfectly to the complex mechanical demands of tank warfare. The D-Day landings had seen Blues and Royals tanks among the first armored vehicles to reach French soil, fighting their way inland against determined German resistance. The campaign that followed, from the breakout at Falaise to the crossing of the Rhine, had demonstrated that the regiment could excel in the most demanding conditions of modern warfare while maintaining the highest standards of military professionalism. The Cold War period had brought new challenges and opportunities. Stationed in Germany as part of NATO's defense against Soviet expansion, the regiment had pioneered many of the tactics and technologies that would define armored warfare for the next half-century. Their role in defending the Fulda Gap, one of the most likely routes for any Warsaw Pact invasion of Western Europe, required constant training and readiness that maintained their fighting edge, even during decades of peace. Meanwhile, the ceremonial responsibilities that had always been central to their identity continued to evolve and expand. The coronation of Elizabeth II in 1953 had showcased the regiment's ability to stage spectacular ceremonial events that captured the imagination of millions of television viewers worldwide. The precision and pageantry that had once been appreciated only by small court audiences now reached global audiences, making the Blues and Royals ambassadors for British military tradition. The Falklands War of 1982 had provided the first major combat test for the regiment since World War II. Operating in the harsh conditions of the South Atlantic, they had demonstrated that their professional skills remained as sharp as ever. The complex logistics of transporting and maintaining armored vehicles in a remote theater, thousands of miles from home bases, had required all the adaptability and resourcefulness that had characterized their predecessors for 3 centuries. More, recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan had tested the regiment in entirely new ways. Counterinsurgency operations in urban environments bore little resemblance to the conventional warfare for which they had trained, but once again, they had adapted successfully. The same flexibility that had allowed the original Horse Guards to transition from palace duties to battlefield service enabled their modern successors to excel in peacekeeping, training foreign armies, and protecting civilian populations in war-torn regions. The technological revolution of the late 20th and early 21st centuries had transformed every aspect of military service, but the fundamental qualities that had always defined the Blues and Royals remained constant. Modern soldiers operated sophisticated electronic systems and precision weapons, but they still required the courage, discipline, and loyalty to comrades that had motivated their predecessors at Blenheim and Waterloo. The regiment's role in training, the armies of allied nations had become increasingly important as Britain sought to maintain global influence through partnership, rather than direct military presence. Blues and Royals officers could be found serving as advisors and instructors from Eastern Europe to the Middle East, sharing 3 centuries of accumulated military expertise with the next generation of professional soldiers. Back home, their ceremonial duties had evolved to meet the demands of modern media and public expectations. Royal weddings, state visits, and national celebrations now required careful coordination with television producers and security services, but the underlying commitment to excellence and attention to detail remained unchanged from the era when their primary audience consisted of a few dozen courtiers. As Colonel Mitchell watched the Queen inspect his soldiers for the final time, he reflected on the extraordinary continuity that connected this moment to that first formation parade in 1661. The faces had changed, the weapons had evolved beyond recognition, and the enemies they faced bore little resemblance to those confronted by their predecessors. But the fundamental commitment to serve the crown faithfully remained as strong as ever. The future would undoubtedly bring new challenges and transformations, but Mitchell was confident that the Blues and Royals would adapt and excel as they always had. The merger of ceremonial excellence with professional military competence that had defined the regiment since its creation would continue to serve Britain well in whatever conflicts and crises lay ahead. The legacy stretching from Buckingham Palace to Horse Guards Parade was more than just a collection of battle honors and ceremonial traditions. It was a living demonstration of how military institutions could evolve and adapt while maintaining their essential character and values across centuries of change.